Now, for everyone else who is going to be sticking around until past, for this final slot, we're going to be talking about designing virtual meetings. So in the last session, there was lots of demand in the comments and the after action review to learn a little bit more about this. In fact, the most common thing that people said they were going to do after the session was exploring different ways to run virtual sessions. So kind of based on that level of demand, we wanted to dedicate some time here. This isn't really a training session. There's obviously lots of places that you can go to get that kind of information. It's more a space for us in Q to share some of our practical learning, particularly thinking about what may be most relevant for the types of meetings and events that you may be responsible for developing. Now, to give you some background for anyone who is new to Q, across the team we've got lots of expertise in designing both large-scale conferences like the annual Q event that takes place in November, as well as the interactive workshops. So I work as part of the Q Lab, and we regularly design and deliver workshops that are aimed at supporting people to use creative tools and methods and support change in health and care. Now, pre-COVID, I'd say that most of us in the Q team weren't completely comfortable in our online meeting design. But for most of us, I think, as with everyone else, it's been a really steep learning curve over the last couple of months. And we've had lots of opportunity to think about how we translate some of our experiences about what works face-to-face and adapt this to more virtual meetings. Now, before I go any further, I'd be really keen to hear some of your experiences. So if you could revert back to your chat box and just answer kind of any thoughts from you about what you find hardest about planning and running virtual meetings, that would be really helpful. Technology featuring very highly. It was discussed very briefly in the group that I was just in just now. Awesome, lots of thoughts. So I'll obviously try and respond to some of these throughout the session. I'm going to be using the chat box like this a few times throughout the session. I won't be pausing lots for Q&A because we don't have lots of time together. But Tracy will be keeping an eye on what's shared in the chat box and will respond to any particular questions that get raised. So I'm now going to talk about 5 principles to consider when you're designing virtual sessions. This is particularly thinking about when you might be meeting with people of kind of 10, 15 people or more, from kind of team meeting size all the way up to sessions like this where you're talking about kind of 100-200 people. And we as a team firmly believe that good virtual meeting design isn't all about the technology, although of course it is an important enabler. The steps that you go through to design virtual meetings should really be very similar to what you do face-to-face. I think you just mostly need to be paying attention to how the experience is going to be different for people and how you can translate your expertise in those kind of sessions to work really well virtually. And that's what I'll be talking through now. So the first principle is to have a clear purpose and determine the mode that you want people to be working in for each activity. I'll start with a really nice and obvious one, but also one that I think you can't really think enough about. Every session should have a really clear objective about what you want to get from it. For example, you may know that you want to have a conversation with your team about staff wellbeing, but you need to be asking yourself kind of, why is this conversation important by now? What are you trying to elicit through the conversation? What are you going to do with any information that gets shared after it takes place? Do you want to be coming up with ideas in the session or more just providing support for people there and then? And all of these questions are going to be really important to help you scope a session that's going to meet those needs. It gives you a really good anchor that you can come back to when you begin to develop your plan. And also it sets out some of the main information that you're going to want to share with people in your pre-information and as part of the meeting, because your participants are obviously going to get much more from the meeting if they really understand why they're there and what success is going to look like. The second principle is to make sure that everyone is able to contribute and engage in the activities. And again, this is really core to normal meeting design, but I think becomes even more important and potentially harder to manage when you're working virtually. We all know there can be people who take up more airtime than others. And in virtual meetings, this can become even more apparent unless you plan for it. If the meeting that you're designing is intended to be collaborative, then one of your main goals has to be that you hear from everyone in the session, whether that is either out loud or in writing. And realistically, open conversation isn't going to work beyond a group of about 8 or so people. So if you've got a bigger group, you need to think more creatively about how you're going to do this. In Q, you will know that we talk a lot about liberating structures and the Q CAPS cards. And the reason that we draw on these so heavily is because they are activities that are really purposefully designed to enable better quality collaboration. Most of them aren't really designed to be used virtually, but we've been having increasing success at adapting these, and I'd really encourage you to have a go. I know that Liberating Structures are doing some training at the moment about virtual sessions as well that Q is looking into. In terms of other ways to bring in voices, you could obviously do the method that we just use in the Conversation Cafe, where a facilitator goes around to each person to ensure they've contributed. This may be a bit more staged than you would normally choose to do in a face-to-face meeting, but for virtual discussions, it can be really successful. And of course, there's lots of technology you can use to help as well. So invite people to comment in the chat box, use the breakout rooms if you've got that functionality on the platform you're using. And think about any other platforms that you can use to capture responses. So things like Slido can be really useful for more interactive data throughout a session. And connected to this, it's also just really important to be explicit with people about how you want them to contribute. For example, whether you want videos on or off throughout the session. Depending on the size of the group and what content you'll be covering, you may also need to think about what's going to make the safe space for people. So what concerns might people be holding, and how can you provide some reassurances in the way that you're inviting contributions? We've included here just an example of some simple instructions that you may want to think about. And I would love to know more about some of your experiences. So what methods have you used to ensure that everyone is able to contribute? We agree, Joy. We also like chat. Well, I don't know about Klaxoon. We'll have to check that out. Awesome. Thank you. Please do keep sharing your thoughts as we go. The third principle is to accommodate for our reduced attention spans and different learning styles. Now, I know that we've definitely had feedback before from our lab webinars about it being a lot harder to hold your attention virtually. And I had definitely heard this feedback before, but I'm not completely sure if I'd understood it until a few months ago, just about how tiring this way of working can really feel. There's obviously some really simple things that you can do here. Limit your meetings to 90 minutes as an absolute maximum. And if you need to do this, definitely build in some proper breaks. Some of the rules about continuous meeting time don't really matter in this format. So you could do a 90-minute slot in the morning and a 90-minute slot in the afternoon. You're trying to get closer to a full day's workshop. In terms of learning styles, try to vary the content and mode of working throughout the session to really keep energy up and engage people in different ways. And the usual things go, I think, about presentations, try and keep them short and snappy with good visuals. And personally, I wouldn't ever want to go beyond 10 minutes in this type of format without some sense of interactivity. The other thing I'd say here is just be experimental. We've been trying a few different things. So in the last session here, we were promoting sketchnoting as a way of helping people to hold attention when they're receiving information, which I've definitely been doing more of personally. And also just challenge some of your preconceptions about how you may deliver a face-to-face session. So for example, reconsider whether you want people to do a bit more in advance. We may often hold back from this because we don't want to overburden people, but I think the rules are very different in a virtual meeting. And if you can strip it back so that only the essential stuff happens in the call, you're much likely to have a high energy conversation that way around. Another thing that we've been trialling more for some of our internal meetings is silent meetings. We've got some dedicated reading time that's built into the meeting agenda. It has a really nice communal aspect and it can be a lot more energizing than having to listen to someone present lots of information because you can really take it in at your own speed. I think we'll be sharing a link to the chat box about someone's experiences of designing silent meetings. The fourth principle is to take advantage of technology kind of when you can and when it feels right. I think any virtual meeting, there'll always be a low-tech and a high-tech way of running it. So for example, today, the only real functionality that we have used is the breakout rooms and the chat box. And this is obviously, hopefully, based on your experiences, been enough to engage a really big group of people for this long. When you're planning to add in extra technology and platforms into a meeting, make sure you're really clear about what you'll be adding and that it's worth the additional complications. The platform that we rely on most in CUE beyond Zoom as the hosting platform is something called Miro. Miro is an online collaboration platform that basically acts like a really big whiteboard, and any number of people can contribute to it at the same time. It's really, really useful for us as a team because we can adapt activities that would have worked really well face-to-face and translate them to a virtual context. So using sticky notes like we would do if we were in a workshop. We used Miro a bit in the last Rapid Learning and Improvement workshop and shared some information about it in the write-up then. There are other very similar tools that you could try, so Mural and Stormboard are two of the other popular ones. We'll also be continuing to trial Miro in some of these sessions. If you would like to have a go more, we will be providing those opportunities. I should say, while it is a really useful tool for us, it does take a little bit of getting used to, so it's not going to work for every audience. And like anything that if it involves technology, it's always helpful to have a plan B in place in case it fails, not least when you're working with people in NHS and social care organisations with obviously really tight restrictions about what people can and can't access. I think some of this has already come up a little bit in the chat already, but we'd be keen to know about people's experiences about the platforms you're using most and what you're finding helpful. Yeah, seems like Teams is the most common platform being used at the moment for NHS. Cool. Thank you. So there's just one principle left to share, and that is about preparation. So people often comment on the professional nature of our CUE and QLab events, and we have this reputation because we prepare as a team a lot. This may not always be relevant for everyone's context, so I'm not suggesting that you should all kind of start working in this way. But if you are maybe demanding a lot in terms of the time commitment from other people, I just caution kind of don't assume that you can make the most of that time without putting the proper preparation in place. Our processes when we're thinking about a bigger session often involve developing very detailed facilitation notes with precise timings down to the minute and very clear roles for the team. I think the roles point in particular is really helpful for virtual meetings more than face-to-face because you obviously can't read a room and you can't see who is doing what and what be being missed. So we're always really explicit about this in advance. If you're delivering quite a lot of information, we also take the time to practice this with our colleagues and see how it sounds out loud. And if you're working with really large numbers, kind of getting into the hundreds, then you really need to just be planning for every eventuality. So for example, for these sessions, we always have a backup host for if and when one of us loses our internet connection, and we share our speaker notes in advance so we can switch roles, hopefully seamlessly, as and when that occurs. We also talk through our plan kind of minute by minute and go through exactly how we think it will work. Now, I hope this has been helpful as a whistle-stop tour into some of the things that we consider as a team. There's obviously lots more that we could go into, but very limited time. So if it's useful, something that we could do in the write-up is to share more of a kind of a meeting checklist. So if you think that would be useful, please do add some comments into the chat box. Now I've got a few final questions that we would like people to respond to. Kind of what have you been seen or been part of that you think is really working well in terms of the virtual meetings that you're attending? And what are some of your thoughts and reflections on what is being shared? I will invite in Trace as well, if it's possible to share kind of any of the content that's being shared in the chat box.
Yes, of course. I mean, one of my reflections from the chat box is that there's a lot of text in the chat box, and a number of people have said actually a bit too much to be able to take note of because it just whizzes by. I think this is the biggest group that we've done and used extensive use of chat, and it's been dynamic, but we'll have, yeah, maybe something for us to think about going forward. Some of the themes that have come up, however, there's been a bit about the kind of rules of engagement for online meetings, and that's come across in various ways. So some people saying there's just loads of silence and that's difficult, and how do I facilitate that, through to the other way, lots of people talking over each other. I think really drawn out a different chairing technique that's required. Lots about tech variation, and I think that ranges from literally the technology working or not working through to skills, through to availability of platforms and basic tech like laptops. And I think a few people for whom interactive virtual meetings are not the norm, and they're not getting lots of those, and so it's just actually somebody commented like even 90 minutes when you're not interacting at all is way too long. So sort of, yeah, a desire I think for more of these ways of working and the enablers that will help people to get those in place. There's huge richness in here. Once we start to analyze it and pull it together, I think there'll be a lot of data that people will be really interested in.
That's really helpful summary. Yeah, and just to add to that, if there are more things that you would like us to be exploring in these sessions in the future, please do let us know. This is very much a kind of a whistle-stop tour.